Hello, theology classes. This is the section of your chapter 1 entitled Knowing God Through Natural Revelation. It starts on page 6 in your textbook. It's going to go through page 7. The question we ask in this section is, can we as humans use our reason and our logic to come to a conclusion that there is a God? The first story they mention on page 7 is of Johannes Kepler, an astronomer living at the beginning of the period known as the Enlightenment. He is famous for determining that the planets orbit around the sun in elliptical orbits. Now, on pages 6 through 7, there's this story about a friend of his who is skeptical of his faith. And in order to sort of illustrate this, he uses a model of the universe that he created. And as it says on the page, his friend comes in and says, "Wow, that model is beautiful. Who built it?" And Kepler very flippantly said, "Oh, nobody built it. It built itself." And the friend, of course, doubts this. And then he says, "Well, my friend, how you say that this toy could not have made itself, but listen to yourself. This model is but a very weak imitation of this vast universe, which I think you said made itself." Something does not come out of nothing. Which brings us to the very next arguments for the existence of God. It sounds a lot like the arguments of this man, St. Thomas Aquinas, famous doctor of the church, and he lived in the 1200s. He was very much a believer that theology wasn't just faith, but faith seeking understanding. And here we see him in this painting. He holds in one hand the church. At his heart he has the Eucharist, and in his left hand he holds a book, which is probably his most famous book, a book called the Summa Theologica. And in that book, the Summa Theologica, Thomas Aquinas, in one section, spent time arguing that the existence of God can be proven in 5 logical ways. Here is a flow chart of this section of the Summa Theologica, just so that you get a sense of the way Thomas liked to reason. The first thing he would always do in his Summa was he would come up with a question. Does God exist? That's up here at the top. And the first thing he would always do is come up with objections to the answer that he wanted to defend. So, for example, over here, he says, it would seem that God doesn't exist. Because if God exists, then there would be no evil in the world, because God is infinite goodness. But there is evil in the world, so therefore God does not exist. And then he has a second objection. It would seem that God doesn't exist because everything in the universe can be explained by either nature or by human reason. So belief in a God, you don't need that. We can explain it by nature or human reason. So therefore there is no God. Then he says, his famous pattern is he brings up the objections, and then he says, on the contrary, God says, I am that I am. I propose that God's existence can be proven in 5 different ways. And the 5 arguments are here in these yellow arrows: motion, first cause, possibility and necessity, perfection, and design. And after he gives these 5 arguments, he then goes and refutes the objections to the argument that God does not exist. So he very carefully comes up with the objections that his opponents would have before they can mention their objections. The first argument is that of motion. And as you can see, we've got dominoes here in the picture falling down. What Aquinas does is he looks at the universe and says, in the universe, things are moving. They're in motion. Now, you guys learn in science class that an object that is at rest will stay at rest unless it is acted upon by an unbalanced force. Thomas doesn't call it an unbalanced force, he calls it a mover. So if something is moving, it was put in motion by a mover, an unbalanced force. So one object was moved by another, was moved by another, was moved by another, very much like these dominoes. One domino falls into the next one, into the next one, into the next one. This chain of movers, however, Thomas says it can't just keep going on forever and ever and ever with no end. It can't go on infinitely. Therefore, there has to be a primary, unmoved first mover. This unmoved mover we call God. And that is the first argument for the existence of God. God is the unmoved mover, first mover. We also have the second argument, which your book has on page 7. Your book says first cause. I put it up here in terms of cause and effect. This is a simple relationship you guys probably learned real early in your schooling. Cause and effect. Okay, something causes something to happen. That thing that happens is an effect. And very much like the first argument, this happens in a chain. There's a cause and then there's an effect, and that effect can then become the cause of another effect and another effect. Like that first argument with movers, this chain of cause and effect does not go on infinitely. Therefore, there must be a first cause, but that cause must be uncaused. Nothing can cause that first cause, and that uncaused cause, we call that God. The third argument on page 7. On page 7, it says everything comes from something. That's not quite the language that Thomas Aquinas used. What he used was the words of necessary and dependent, or possible. And I have a little chart here. It's a little family tree that shows how in order for us to exist, in order for us to be possible or dependent, we are dependent on our parents and their grandparents and the great-grandparents, etc. So very much like the first two arguments, things in the universe depend on other things to exist, like we depended on our parents, and those parents each depended on their sets of parents, etc., etc. Those other things are necessary for the others to exist. Grandma and Grandpa were necessary for my mom to exist, as well as they were necessary for my dad to exist. Same with you guys. And then both your parents are necessary for you to exist. We are dependent on them. And when you have children, you will be necessary for them to be possible, for them to exist. Like the first two arguments, the chain cannot go on forever. It can't be infinite, so that there must be an ultimate necessary being. A being upon which everything depends, but this being depends on nobody, and this being we call God. The next argument has to do with the concept of perfection. In your book, it says the supreme model. So, for example, in nature, we see different degrees of perfection, kind of like with this picture of the trees. This is, a tree. But this tree is a little bigger. It's probably a little better. It embodies a little more of what we mean by a perfect tree. And then the taller one, it's even more perfect, more leaves, more branches, looks more symmetrical. It's a more perfect tree, more perfect. You can keep going up the scale. But the idea that we can compare perfection, Thomas says that means that the idea of perfection must actually exist if we can compare it. So therefore, this all-perfect being, this source of all perfection, we call God. And the final argument is on page 8, number 5. Number 5 in your book, they call it the grand designer. I have it up here, the idea of the ordered universe. Here's the Milky Way galaxy up here, the spiral galaxy. What Thomas does is he looks at the universe and he says, you know what? Everything in the universe has got an order to it. The sun rises, the sun sets, the moon rises, the moon goes down, the rivers flow to the sea, the winds and the tides and all these things, they work together, all the way down to an atomic level, all the electrons and the protons and the nucleus of atoms, they all work together, and this universe keeps right on ticking, as it should. Everything does what it's supposed to do in this universe in order for it to function. This order Thomas says, it has to be the product of some type of design. He says this order is too orderly to have happened by chance. It is way too ordered. There's too much order in the universe for it to have been an accident. So if this is not an accident, it means that there is a design to the universe, a plan. If there's a design, that means necessarily there has to be a designer. And therefore, God is that all-intelligent designer, or the all-intelligent being. And those are Thomas Aquinas' 5 arguments for the existence of God. Go back and pause this video anytime you need in order to get the notes down. Now, what your assessment will be. For tomorrow's class, you're going to turn to page 10 in your book, and there is a section called For Reflection. There are 2 bullets in that section. I would like you guys to type or neatly write 5 to 6 sentences responding to the very first bullet, which has 2 questions. Those questions are, which proof for God's existence is the most convincing, and why? Which of Thomas's 5 proofs or 5 arguments convinces you the most? All right? And we will discuss those reflections tomorrow in class. We'll hand those in. All right. Thanks very much for watching, everyone. Good luck.